What is a complete human? Is it a cover model? Is it a science geek? Is it a fitness expert? Or all of the above and more? Jana and Evan are crusaders that walk the earth looking at today's issues that touch our hearts and minds. The honest and hopeful outlook on the advancement of today's society. The science behind the decay of human relationships. The necessary preparations for future generations. Join us as we look deep inside ourselves and embark on a journey into becoming a complete human.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of the Complete Human Podcast with your host,
Jana Breslin
and Evan DeMarco. For the last couple of years, you've been up in Sacramento, and in that, you've got to experience what the fires have done to air quality up here. And interestingly enough, I think that we've spent a number of days looking at the air quality index score almost to determine whether or not we could go outside. What we haven't realized, or what we finally realized in all of that, is that the air quality outside might be as even better than the air quality inside. For a whole host of reasons, of which we're going to talk about with our next guest. So I'm super excited to talk about air quality with Dilip Goswami, who's the president and CTO of Molekule. If you guys have been scrolling through Instagram or Facebook, you've seen these just freaking awesome looking air purifiers. And we've got the man behind that. So Dilip, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Jana and Evan, for having me.
Yes, absolutely. And you forgot to mention the allergies up here.
Oh, that's horrible.
Allergies are bad, so we need a little help sometimes.
We need a lot of help. So, interestingly enough, we're so aware these days of what we're putting in our body and the food that what we're putting on our body and the skincare and all the things that especially the girls buy. But very few people actually pay attention to probably one of the most important things, and that's air quality. So we're really interested to kind of jump into this, and can you really explain air quality and why we need to pay attention to this, and just really what breathing clean air means for the human population?
Absolutely. And you kind of hit on it in the beginning, which is that one of the things that's really struck me, and it's been actually incredibly important for my health and wellness journey as well, is how much attention we put to, for example, eating. Right? You eat maybe 3 times a day, maybe more, maybe less, depending on your routine, right? And at the same time, you breathe 20,000 times a day, right? So it's a much more frequent activity, and you actually exchange more mass on a regular basis through breathing, through respiration, than through eating. And then the final piece is that even that if you think about the food you eat, that metabolic process, the breathing, the respiration is what actually enables the energy for that process to happen, right? So it's really fundamental to living, breathing, but because it's something that's handled unconsciously, like the beating of our hearts, we don't often think about it really directly, even though it has such a profound influence on our life. And so because of that, even though it has such a huge influence on our health, it's not something that's always at the forefront of mind unless something really overt happens, like you're dealing with wildfire smoke, or you're dealing with some specific allergy. That sometimes brings it right to the forefront. But for everybody, it's incredibly influential on your life.
Yeah, and I think you brought that up, right? 20,000 times a day we breathe in and we breathe out, but that's just it's so innate that we don't even think about that. Obviously, 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, air quality was so much better. So these are things like air purifiers. Obviously, were trees 100 years ago, but with everything that we've done to our planet, we've kind of changed that. So let's talk a little bit about how evolution and technological evolution have really impacted our air quality and the things that we really need to be aware of that we didn't have to be maybe even 50 years ago.
Yeah. So really simply, there's sort of two pieces to that, right? One is the pollutants that are sort of generated, that are new, that we're being exposed to, that we haven't been exposed to over those many thousands of years of us evolving, right? But the other piece is also the changes in the context of our environment that have caused it to be more difficult to deal with pollutants that we would normally be okay with dealing with. And let me touch on that piece first, right? Because one of the things that's really interesting, one of the things you talked about smoke, right, from wildfires, and you talked about we talked about allergens, right? So those are two things that have sort of wildfires have been happening forever, right? Even before humanity, there were wildfires, right? And pollen blooms and all of these things are natural. They've been around forever, right? But what happens is that outdoors, you have wind and diffusion and these things that dilute those pollutants over across the atmosphere, right? So you may have an acute problem if you're immediately downstream of a wildfire, right? But eventually, that smoke disperses and then the air becomes breathable again outdoors, right? And then similarly with pollen, you may have an acute problem immediately, but eventually that disperses, right? But one of the problems is that since sort of the 50s, when we started instituting air conditioning, and then even more recently, as we've rightfully cared about energy efficiency and these things in our buildings, we've built buildings with tighter and tighter envelopes. So we let less air in and out, right? Because first it was so that you can condition the air, right? And then later on, we built it tighter and tighter because you spend a lot of energy to condition that air indoors and keep it at a comfortable level. And so you don't want to have to do that a lot, right? To have to keep conditioning a lot of air. So, those are all good things, but what that meant is that pollutants can build up and concentrate indoors, right? And these days, we're spending more and more and more of our time indoors, and that leads to us being exposed to even pollutants that would otherwise might you might have some outdoors might get diffused. Indoors, they're building up to levels that are unhealthy for us. And then the other piece is just that we've started creating a lot of pollution that we hadn't been exposed to, right? Almost everything that's manufactured outgasses some VOCs. VOCs are volatile organic chemicals. What that means is that they're these chemicals that are used in manufacturing, things like solvents, et cetera, that permeate these materials, and at room temperature, they actually become gaseous. So they come out of that material and they get into the air. And so that, then you have industrial pollution, you have, what comes out of the tailpipe of cars, all of these things combining to make a mix that is something that's pretty unique in human history, like especially in the last 50 years.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was going to say, you always hear the term, let's get outside and get fresh air. But yeah. Is the outside air even that healthy these days? I mean,
yeah, it's a challenge. So what I'd say is that it's a matter of, and it depends on the context, right? So sometimes, like if there's a wildfire going on, or if you're in an area of extreme pollution, right? So my family is from India, right? And when I was a kid, I used to go to Delhi regularly. And one of the things that changed over the years is that I used to go there and my asthma would be fine. I would feel great because the climate suits me well. But then later on, the pollution outdoors was so great that I just couldn't breathe when I was there. Even if I go outdoors, I need a mask, right? So context can change. And it's the same thing with, for example, here with wildfires, right? These wildfires, some of them have gotten to be so big that they're not just for a short time in a small area, but they're actually, the smoke from that is traveling across the country and being carried by wind currents in the atmosphere. So the air outdoors is also, there's a lot of threats there that have happened, but oftentimes in the regular context here in the US, the air indoors can be significantly worse.
So let's talk a little bit about that then, Dilip, because I think that, again, people think about like the tailpipe of the car and maybe the wildfires. But what other things are, like, really, when we look at like pollutants and bacteria and the VOCs, what really are the most prolific things that we as a species are dealing with, especially as we're confined in these tighter and tighter buildings that, as you pointed out, are more energy efficient.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the way that I think about these pollutants is that they're sort of particulate pollutants, right? And that's probably the thing that everybody's the most familiar with. Like you can visually see dust, right? So that, and normally when you think of like, okay, dirty air, you're evoking images of dust or something visible, visible smoke. And that's sort of the traditional thing that a lot of folks think about, and that is certainly a problem. In fact, that's when we're talking about wildfire smoke. A lot of what we actually see is the visual part of it, right? But the thing that's tricky is that the pollutants that actually impact our health the most are the most microscopic ones. And that's because we evolved with sort of a respiratory system that does some level of filtration in and of itself, right? So only the very smallest of particles, like we evolved in dusty environments, right? But these very smallest particles, and a lot of them are pretty unique types of pollutants. We'll talk about some of those, but those very smallest particles are the ones that penetrate the deepest into your lungs. And so those are the ones that you have to worry about the most when it comes to particulate, right? The very smallest. And of course, there's gaseous pollutants, right? Other than particles, there's gases, and these these are just individual molecules dispersed, right? So they can, of course, penetrate the deepest into your lungs. And those, I think the class to worry about the most are VOCs, volatile organic chemicals, again, because almost any modern manufactured product outgasses VOCs. It's something that we actually specifically test our parts for, to make sure that coming from our manufacturer, that we limit the amount of outgassing so that our air purifier is being a net positive in your environment. It's not emitting anything. So VOCs are incredibly important. The other one from industrial pollution, or tailpipes of cars, are these things called colloquially known as NOx and SOx. They're nitrous oxides or sulfur oxides. Those are also dangerous gases, but they're not typically found in the context of a home, right? That's if you have a significant source of industrial pollution near you, then you might see elevated levels of that, and that can have some major negative health impacts. The final category is probably the one that we've, unfortunately all thought of the most over the past, 2 years now, going on 2 years, is bioaerosols, right? And bioaerosols is a broad category. There's mold spores, right? Mold is something that, for example, particularly impacts me. And there's many, millions more out there that have some specific mold sensitivities, but it's fairly ubiquitous and difficult to get rid of. You also have airborne bacteria, right? There can be different kinds of bacterial infections. And then you have, airborne infectious disease in terms of viruses as well. So that's kind of the broad range of different types of pollutants that you see. And each one of those are very different, right? Gases are very different from particulate, or very different from the way that these bioaerosols behave. So you have to really think about how you approach each one of these different problems.
And I think those are all great. And I think that you left out one of the most important, and again, I don't mean to tell you your job, but what about the people that crop dust inside?
Oh my God.
So I had to bring up a fart joke at some point in an air quality show.
Oh yeah. Thankfully, most of the time that's pretty harmless. Although you never know.
After a steady diet of Taco Bell, those are definitely VOCs.
I believe that.
Okay, sorry, it just had to happen.
So I have a question. Our lungs, right? We have organs and systems in our body that help us detox these things, right? Are we at the point with our lung health and our lungs where we can process these things naturally, or are we at the point with our environments that we do need additional help? Like it's kind of a mandatory thing to make sure that you are supporting your body in every way possible.
Yeah, so absolutely. The body has ways of purging toxins. Many of these things we have been exposed to over time, right? And so, we wouldn't have survived as humanity until now unless we had some way of purging some of these toxins from our body and shielding ourselves from them, right? So, yes, that's true, right? But at the same time, the majority of that evolution has happened in a period where we were, living primarily outdoors or in shelter that's basically, has open air exchange, right? So you even think about, let's say, 50 years ago, right? Or even frankly, when I was growing up, like we didn't have air conditioning everywhere. You open windows, right? Like, so there's a lot more, free flow of air. And so we're not getting these things building up to the level that they are today, right? And so, and that's why sometimes you feel like, okay, it's really stuffy inside. I need to get outside. That's your body actually telling you, like, look, the air in here is not healthy. It's not having a positive impact on me. And so stepping outside will, you're unconsciously, that's your body signaling you to say, like, hey, I need to breathe cleaner air, right? So it depends on your individual context, right? You might have a space that's really well ventilated and and works quite well, and otherwise there's no, you can control sources to say, hey, we're not going to bring in anything that could be a potential pollutant. But that's really challenging. For one, just human beings, as we move in an environment, our dead skin cells shed. That's where a lot of the dust comes from. We cough, we sneeze, we're expelling bioaerosols into the environment. And then almost anything that you buy will have some degree of outgassing, right? So it's a good idea to supplement whatever else you're doing. Like, you want to do source control, you want to be conscious about what you bring into that environment, but it's also a good idea to have something that can take care of that excess buildup, right? And you'll find that in a majority of modern environments, especially indoors, that air can be quite unhealthy. And then the other thing is that we've also learned a lot more about what is healthy air, right? So, for example, the WHO recently announced that 90% of the world's inhabitants are breathing air that's higher than their recommended levels in terms of pollution. So
90%.
90%. Yeah.
That's crazy.
So,
Wow.
yeah. So almost everywhere we've got some sort of air pollution problem, and whether it be indoors, outdoors, and it's ubiquitous. So I think it behooves us to add in some other interventions that can help clean up that problem, because it's almost it's very difficult to do just by controlling sources.
Absolutely.
And I do want to get to, those therapies that, obviously we're here to talk a lot about Molekule, but before we get to that, I'm very interested in kind of the research that your company has done on, we've got 90% of the world that's breathing basically unclean air. Are there things that you guys have found that we can actually do to support healthier air on the outside so that we're not relying so heavily on kind of this purified internal air?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's the same way there, right? It's like source control. And then, so some of the things are quite difficult to handle, right? Like, I'd say increased frequency of wildfires, record pollen plumes around the world, and then, increased rise of infectious disease. These are all, fairly predictable consequences of climate change. So the work that we're trying to do to try to, prevent some of that certainly applies in this case as well, right? And then, of course, you want to try to control sources. So, limiting the, ability to pollute the air, I think is incredibly important. If you look at the passage of the Clean Air Act here in the US, that was a landmark, and getting that done around the world and really curbing that could have tremendous positive impact on human populations around the world. So there's those things. The other piece is that our nature sort of, there's built-in purification, right? So you said like trees were the first air purifiers, right? That's absolutely true. That our environment naturally breaks down these pollutants, right? Then there's the problem of secondary pollution, because you take these, maybe larger particles or larger pollutants and they break up into smaller ones, but eventually they get completely destroyed. They get completely broken down, right? That's the sort of natural process. They get oxidized in these outdoor environments. And so, basically preserving nature and making sure that you have a healthy environment and ecosystem outdoors goes a significant way to help detoxifying the entire atmosphere. So so there are definitely those natural steps that you can take outdoors. And then there's even more that you can do just specifically in your indoor environment if you want to control your space as well.
Well, let's get into that. And I think that kind of is a nice segue into the Molekule, which we've had in the house for a little bit. And one of the things I'm very curious about, because we use our Whoop, which kind of tracks our sleep. And I've noticed since we turned this thing on in the bedroom, like my sleep scores are significantly better. Like respiratory rate is better. Like how is Molekule different than just the air purifier that I think I had when I was in high school?
Sure. So one thing, let me just touch on that point about sleep, and then let me talk about what Molekule, because this is actually something that we certainly thought about quite a bit as we were developing the Molekule. But one of the papers that I read early on that really, for me, influenced a lot of the work that I was doing in Molekule was looking at air purification specifically in the sleep breathing zone, right? So one of the things that we saw in literature through, of course, this is not, we haven't seen large scale conclusive data on this, but there have been a few RCTs and studies that show some really promising results, that the air that you breathe when you sleep is incredibly important, sets the tone for your whole day, and has a big impact on quite a few things, from metabolism to general health to, for example, your allergy symptoms through the day, overall quality of life. There's quite a few wide-ranging impacts that we've seen in the literature. And so that was a profound impact on me, because I grew up with asthma and allergies, and so I was starting each day from a state of coughing, sneezing, just not feeling great in the morning, and thinking that, okay, well, I know that I have all these problems that are related to triggers in the air that are causing these symptoms, right? And so how do I take care of that, right? And that was sort of the genesis of Molekule. And what we developed at Molekule was a real, what I'd say, like a broad approach to dealing with these pollutants. So in our device, as opposed to a traditional filter, we have filtration, so we can capture particulate like anybody else, but we have the PICO technology. And PICO stands for photoelectrochemical oxidation. Now that's a mouthful, but what it means is that we have lights inside of our device that shine onto a specially coated filter surface. And when that coating sees light, it generates a chemical reaction that actually breaks down these pollutants. And so that means that we can do more than just catch particles in a filter. We can actually, these things like, I mentioned gases, right? We can actually break down those gases into their base components, just, water, CO2, nitrogen, the things that are already, that make up clean air. And when it comes to bioaerosols, we can actually inactivate them. We can actually literally break them apart until there's nothing left. So it takes a wide approach to dealing with that range of pollutants that we talked about. And instead of just trying to capture them in a fabric, what we're doing is we're actually destroying these pollutants. That's the real key difference with Molekule.
And that brings up an interesting question for me, is looking at some of the other filtering technology out there, right? You've got some type of charcoal or carbon filter. It's basically just a mesh, right? So if you're just trapping that stuff and you go to take that filter out and replace it, are you just really kind of reintroducing those pollutants, those bacteria, those, pollens, all of those things back into the air? Because it seems, it kind of reminds me of the dryer vent, right? Like when I pull that thing out, I see like particles go everywhere. Is that really the essence of kind of base filtering technology?
Yeah, so there's absolutely the potential to reintroduce, as you change those filters, to reintroduce pollutants into the air. There's a lot of different drawbacks, right? You mentioned, for example, charcoal or carbon filters, right? So the interesting thing, by the way, charcoal, that's the oldest filtration that's out there, right? So humanity's tried to charcoal filter water, for example, for thousands of years. Actually, I think as much as 10,000 years ago, they found the remains of the first charcoal filter. So these are things that are well known, right? And we've been trying them for a long period of time. The challenge is, like, for example, with that carbon filter, right? The way that it traps these gases is actually, funnily enough, fairly similar to the way that a textile filter will trap a particle, which is that those gases come and they basically just get stuck to the surface, okay? And that's an equilibrium process, what I mean by that is that when the concentration of the gas in the air changes, how much that stuff stays stuck to the surface of that carbon also changes, right? So you could have, for example, you could have a room where you introduce something, for example, let's say you're cooking something, you burn, there's a bunch of VOCs coming out, they all get stuck onto the carbon filter, then you open your window, you clear everything out, you close it, and now the air is at a very clean level, but the filter is saturated, it could actually start letting that stuff back into the air, right? And when it comes to, for example, biosols, mold could potentially even grow on those filters, right? We've actually done an experiment in the lab where we aerosolized some mold we deposited on a filter, and we actually saw it growing on that filter fabric with no dust, there's nothing on the fabric, just the mold got deposited and it just grew on the fabric, right? So there are all kinds of challenges with an approach where you just try to capture pollutants, right? And that's why it's important to actually destroy them, right? Because you want to take care of the problem. Like, you don't want it to just stop it and then move it from place to place or have it potentially come back. You want to take care of the problem. That's really, the difference with Molekule is that we're destroying those pollutants.
And I think you just touched on the, one of the fundamental problems that we all have. It's like, it's Band-Aids for broken legs, right? We don't fix the problems. We just, sweep them under the rug and then, wait for somebody else to deal with them or for them to rear their ugly head later.
Right. It all comes down to education too, right? I mean, a lot of consumers who are buying these filters in hopes to improve their air quality inside, there's just not that much education out there as to, is this filter actually helping the internal health of my home?
Yeah. And what I'd say is that, and the simplest way to understand this, right, is that HEPA filters were invented in the 40s. They were commercialized in the 50s, right? So we've had them for many, many years. So let's say 70 years, right? And we've still got air quality problems, right? So we've sort of widely deployed filters. We've still got air quality problems. So there's a need for a new solution, right? A need for something that does things differently. And honestly, for me, this journey started for me when I was a kid, right? My father actually started developing this technology back when I was a kid, and he didn't set out to work on indoor air quality. His field is solar energy. He started working on this because I had health issues, and we tried everything out there. We literally tried everything that was available, and it didn't work for me. And that's why we set out in search of, okay, let's invent something new, because our background is in science and engineering, and we felt like, okay, if something that's out there isn't good enough for us, then we'll figure out something that is, and we can improve it. So and that's what we've done here, and that's why we started Molekule.
Yeah, I love hearing that, right? We've actually had the benefit of talking to a lot of entrepreneurs, and it seems like so many of the great technologies of the modern era are born just from that. It's not like I want to go out and make $1 billion and be the next Elon Musk. I just want to solve a problem. And for you, it was, childhood asthma, which is interesting because I remember kind of early COVID days. I think it was Mumbai where they said like it was for the first time ever you could see like across the city because people weren't driving. And having been there, it's like, air quality in India is not fantastic.
Yeah, yeah.
So I imagine that there's a lot of people in India and China and really industrialized as well as population dense countries that are suffering from some of the same things that you were suffering from.
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's hard to say. For example, like with allergies and asthma, it's hard to like have a direct conclusive link of, okay, this is the cause for why somebody may have these problems, right? And there's a lot of different factors. There's genetic too. I have some genetic predisposition for asthma that's there. But at the same time, we do know that in areas that have much higher exposures, you see higher rates of these things, right? And so, and that's really what, it's not about sort of completely eliminating everything and having a sterile environment. That's not what, that's not even what our molecule does. It can't completely sterilize your environment, right? It's about bringing everything to a healthy level, right? So, right now we're at extremes in places like, if you go to Mumbai, actually, the interesting thing about Mumbai is that also happens after it rains, right? Because our atmosphere kind of naturally pulls out a lot of that stuff out of the air, right? But then after a couple of days, it can go back up again, right? In places like Delhi or Beijing, that's less frequent than somewhere coastal like Mumbai, and so the problem becomes even more, right? And then you even have places that you wouldn't think have air quality problems, that because of their local environment, you have mountains, you have inversion layer, so air kind of stays settled in an area, and you get a pocket. That same thing that's happening, when I talk about things, sitting together indoors. So there's so many different factors that can lead to us being exposed to these, high levels of pollution, or things that are unsafe, or forget about unsafe, just lower our quality of life and our overall wellness as well, right? It's not just about, okay, do you develop a disease? It's also like, are you able to live your best life? Are you able to perform to your best potential? There's a ton of links between air quality and productivity as well. So if you have high levels of VOCs in an environment, cognitive performance can decline by 30 to 40%. There's studies that have shown that. So
wow,
I believe that.
it's pretty crazy.
I remember we had the fires. Our house is not very well insulated, and it's just like large cracks. I knew there was just the bad air getting into the house. I totally recognize that my mental, like the cognition, the focus, all that, it was just not working.
Oh no,
nearly as much as it should be.
We did a show at that point, and I think you were just grunting half of it, which is bad because I was grunting the other half.
It's quite possible. So we've talked a lot about asthma and allergies and stuff. I'm very curious about immune health too, right? So with this technology, I mean, we're able to clean up bacteria, viruses, pollutants, all these other things. Let's talk about how this technology helps with our immune health.
Yeah, so it's all about getting the right level of exposure, right? So I mentioned, for example, that the molecule doesn't make things sterile, right? But it also doesn't allow things to build up and concentrate. And so, when it comes to immune health, it's all, like I said, it's all about having a reasonable exposure level, right? Like it's just like, if you're exposed to something at a reasonable level, then you can build up some tolerance, or you can, you can build up some immunity. But if you're exposed to a too high level, then it can make you sick, right?
Yeah.
So
we don't want to be bubble boy and girl,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't want to be that, but at the same time, you don't want to get something that you don't want to get an overwhelming amount that leaves you in a difficult state, right? So it's all about getting into the right level, right? And that's why, for example, we have devices like the Mini Plus and the Molekule Pro. These devices have sensors in them that basically sense the air quality and modulate the response based on what the pollutant levels are in the air, right? And all that has a major positive impact. One thing I'll also mention just on the this is just a personal anecdote, right? So it's not something that I've got, clinical studies or anything to back up with.
Hey, we love N of 1 around here.
Yeah. But for me personally, when I moved out to California back in 2006, I started working at this company. In my first 6 months of work, I was out sick for a month. I just kept getting sick. Like, it was dispersed over the 6 months, but like it's a total of a month out of the first 6 months. And, I was pretty worried because I thought, okay, well, that's not going to work. Like if you just don't, if you're sick that often, people feel like they can't rely on you. And so and of course also like it sucks to be sick that often, right?
Yeah.
And
I love how your brain went to the reliability first, and then you're like,
well, I was sort of like, this is my first job out in California, so I felt like, okay, I want to make my mark and stick out here, but like I went to the first doctor I went to just told me like, oh, this is bad luck. Like it's bad luck that you're getting sick so often. Every time it's like something that is not life-threatening. It's you'll get over it. You may need to take some antibiotics or it's a virus and you just need to take some ibuprofen and your fever will come down and you'll be okay. But it happened over and over for me. And I was really getting frustrated with it. And I called up my dad to talk to him about this. And he was like, well, you moved out to California. You didn't take your, we had, at that time, we just had these black boxes that were literal black boxes that we were hand making, with the technology that he had developed inside of there. And he was like, you didn't take your air purifier with you, and maybe try that, right? And so I did, and I was great. In fact, the next year I ended up starting my grad school at Stanford, and I didn't have those kinds of problems since then. And one of the things that I learned just for myself personally in my body was that dealing with because I have allergies, because I have asthma, all of these things were creating basically some response, right, inside of my body, and some inflammatory response over and over and over. And so I was kind of stretched to a breaking point, right? And that left my immune system a lot weaker to deal with a lot of these other threats that were coming at it. And so because it was responding to things that didn't need to respond to, those allergens and all these other things. And so basically bringing those things to a better level for me, just for me personally, made a big difference. And I like I said, it's N of 1. I don't know if that applies to anybody else, but for me, it helped quite a bit. And there's certainly the potential, just from a logical perspective, that air purification can help with that. Like if you're getting the right exposure level, then you're less likely to be stretched to a breaking point. And so you're going to be better able to deal with whatever is coming in.
And I'd like to extrapolate on that too. And I know that you won't say this on your behalf, but I will, is that in the current climate where we're all, potentially facing COVID, whether that's Delta or Omicron or the next variant, is any little step that we can take back from the brink of where our bodies are overstressed, where we're actually immunocompromised, puts us in a better position to deal with these things. And it sounds like the beauty of your technology is not only does it help us modulate or even resolve inflammation simply by virtue of kind of giving our bodies a break that they need in this overly polluted climate, but your device actually can kind of take some of those those viral particles out of the air, right?
Yeah, the way that we explain it is that we can reduce the bioburden in an environment, right? So when you look at viruses, bacteria, mold, these bioaerosols that I was talking about, we can reduce
Farts.
the concentrations in the air, right? Yeah, and sorry, yeah, I mean, like SARS-CoV-2 is a virus that we've done testing on directly, right? And you can go to our website and see the results of that testing, and judge for yourself if you think that's a good solution for you. But you know, all of these different things have an impact on the body, right? Now, can we directly say that an air purifier can decrease your inflammatory response and all these things? We haven't done the studies to say that, right? But what we do know is that these things in the air can cause that response, and we can decrease the concentration of those things, right? So that's sort of the approach that we're taking, is like, okay, if you know these things are unhealthy for you, you know that these things can cause something negative for you, why not try to reduce your exposure to those things, and hopefully that should make you healthier.
That's that instance of where logic actually trumps FDA, protocols on what you can and cannot say.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I think that you do, it's a good thing to do all the studies necessary to really conclusively prove something. And it's important to look at everything with the right level of uncertainty, right? But use your judgment as well, right? So, you can't say that there's a conclusive link between these two things, right? My personal logic dictates that, my personal experience, anecdotal experience, dictates that I believe that, right? And I think that there's some level of uncertainty, like because here's the thing, there's a lot of different things in your environment, right? Just doing one intervention is not going to solve everything for you, right? So what you need to do is, live a healthy lifestyle. You need to do all of these different things. And in addition to that, adding in an air purifier can have a significant positive impact, right? But it's not a magic bullet on its own that's going to solve the problem for you. It's something that you do as part of doing, comprehensively. And that's why I love the name Complete Human, right? Because you really need to take a complete look at your environment, everything you're exposed to, and make healthy decisions across the board to live your best life.
Dilip, I'm absolutely in love with the fact that you said that, because I think there's so many people out there that want to say that, our product or our idea, our technology is a silver bullet. And as you pointed out, there isn't that. It's a journey. We all have to make responsible choices. You're not going to buy an air purifier and still eat, ice cream and Pringles all day long and expect that that's going to make you healthy.
Very comprehensive approach.
Conversely, you can do all of the right things. And if you're living in a toxic, cesspool, then you're obviously not going to be healthy as well. And I remember actually reading a WHO article, this was years ago, but it said that yours or my daughter's generation was, the probability of death or some type of issue because of respiratory issues from pollution was going to be one of the major contributing factors to early mortality. And I think we see that, and especially in really, population dense places like China, like India, even places in South America, these are becoming prolific issues that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, the way to think about it is, breathing is the thing that you do the most of through the day, right? You're breathing 20,000 times a day. That's more than you're doing anything else, right? Air is, I mean, like, if you've ever been sort of diving or underwater, like, air is life. You run out of the air, you're
you take
gone,
it for
right?
granted.
Yeah, we take it for granted because we're just swimming in it, right? We're just like a fish in the ocean. You take water for granted, right? But air is literally life. It's the most important thing to life. Like, it's you can go pretty long time without food. You can go a reasonably long time without water. You can't go more than minutes without air, right? Even sort of the best of us can't go more than it's more than a certain number of minutes without air. So it's intimately impacted your life, and at the same time, the environment and the air you breathe has not gotten better over time. It's gotten worse, right?
Mhm.
So a lot of other things, for example, water, oftentimes in human history, people have drunk, would drink water that is not safe, and that's been a major cause for human harm over time, right? And so because of that, we've become really careful about, there's about our water supplies, about testing water, about purifying water. But at the same time, while we've improved on water quality, we've gotten much worse on air quality.
Yeah.
And I think people are now starting to wake up to that, especially over the past few years as we've learned how dangerous certain things in the air can be. Hopefully, everybody's now much more aware of that things in the air can make you sick across the board, right? Whether it's some acute exposure and something that causes a disease, or whether it's more systemic exposure over time, and something that gradually causes your health to decline.
Did you ever see Spaceballs?
I did.
Remember that scene where Mel Brooks is like Perry Air, and he's like because their air quality is so bad. Like it is
Yeah.
funny, like Flint, Michigan, on the water quality. It was like we've spent so much time addressing water, but again, you can go a couple days without water. You can't go more than a couple minutes without air. So when is the government going to take rapid steps to curb the constant issues that we are, or constant pollutants that we're putting in our air? So I guess until then, obviously we've got amazing companies like yours to help with the technology. One of the questions that I was very curious about, there's that sensor on the molecule, which actually tells you what your air quality is like. You guys have probably taken readings from all different places across the globe. Like, where do you see the worst air quality on a consistent basis? I think New York, right? Like if I'm in an apartment in New York, like your air quality is just going to suck no matter what. But have you really seen some specific geographic locations where air quality is habitually bad?
One of the things that we've seen that's really interesting is because, and there's certainly places where you can look at the air quality outdoors, and I think you find consistently that there's different. Oftentimes, the worst air quality moves from different places around the world. Although unfortunately, often it's been in Asia. But what I would say is the thing that's interesting is we've also seen indoor air quality trends sometimes follow those outdoor air quality trends, right? So, for example, earlier this year when there were some large wildfires burning in the U.S., and these are really terrible situations, but it's not just impacting the immediate area where there's the most harm, but it's also downstream where where there's the smoke, and then that smoke traveled actually all the way from the western United States all the way to New York, and decreased the air quality in New York, believe it or not. And one of the things we saw was we actually saw that trend across our purifiers readings across the country. So as that smoke traveled across the country, we saw increased in interior readings inside of people's homes, right? So what that's telling us is like, okay, this outdoor quality gets worse, it gets pulled into the home, and then outdoors the wind keeps blowing, right? So eventually the smoke stops and the wind blows all the smoke away, right? But then as it migrated, it went across to all these homes, and so it showed that it infiltrated into the homes, right? And then it stayed there until our purifiers ramped up, because the sensor measured higher levels and then pulled that pollution back down to a normal level. So that's one of the more fascinating things that we've seen, is we've seen that outdoor air quality, what that impact ends up being indoors. Like you said, in Sacramento, you could feel that smoke coming into your home. We've seen that across the states, across the whole environment, and seen those trends play out on a larger scale.
It's crazy.
It is. So I think we're closing in on time, right?
Yep.
But so you guys have been gracious enough to offer our listeners 10% off their own Molekule with code CompleteHuman. But for those who can't afford a Molekule at this time, or can't get one at this time, do you have any tips or recommendations as far as how they can improve the internal health of their home? Is this essential oils? Is this avoiding stuff like Febreze? Is this non-toxic cleaners? What would you say are kind of some baseline foundational things that we should focus on for better inside air quality?
Absolutely. So what I'd say two things. First, we have a lot of great tips on this at our on our Molekule blog. That's molekule.science, Molekule with a K, right? But beyond that, there's a couple of things. One is that there are certain types of plants, certain species of plants that are natural air purifiers. They don't, you need a huge volume of them to really keep up with a lot of the levels that we have in modern pollution. But what you can do is, if you can't afford an air purifier, you can maybe potentially afford an air quality monitor, right? Those are fairly cheap, right? And you can actually see what those levels are. Looking at your air outdoors in your area and your air indoors, you can kind of do some arbitrage of like open the windows when the air outdoors is better, right? And get that ventilation into your home, right? And then close it when the air outdoors becomes worse, and preserve the air quality within your home, right? So
idea.
Ventilating in the right way and being informed about it can help quite a bit. The other thing is, is bringing in the right plants into your home. And then finally, like being really careful. Like I mentioned, source control. And what I mean by that is everything that you're bringing into your home, and this is difficult because there aren't a lot of, and we've come up with some standards ourselves for measuring any, manufactured parts that come into our devices. But at the same time, one thing that you can do is your nose is actually an incredibly sensitive gas sensor. Okay. So when you open something up, there's like you can think of like a new car smell or a new product smell, right? That smell is VOCs. So if you're bringing something new into the home, like a new piece of furniture or a new rug or some new electronics or gadget or something, keeping that in a well-ventilated space, let it outgas, right, until that smell subsides. That'll make sure that you don't have a hugely elevated level in your home. And you can largely, if you start paying attention and actually just trying to smell these things, you can largely tell a lot of not all of them, some of them are odorless, but you can largely tell a lot of the different things that outgas and can pollute your indoor environment quite a bit. So just trying to be aware, do some research on all the products you buy, and try to bring things into your home that are safer and don't have a lot of these issues.
Fantastic tips.
Great point. And ladies and gentlemen, I will give you my own anecdote on this one. Since we, at the beginning of all of the fires, were concerned with air quality, I decided to add a bunch of plants to our house, of which almost none of them are alive. So if you're anything like me and you cannot keep a damn plant alive, I highly recommend the Molekule as a premium replacement for that idea. It's a lot less work.
It's gorgeous.
It's gorgeous.
Yeah.
And you don't have to water it.
No.
Because I forget to do that, or I overwater it. And I'm like, and then it dies anyway. Dilip, thank you so much. Again, I think as we really, make an effort to, educate people on health and wellness, to educate and inspire healthier people for a healthier planet, focusing on air quality, both exterior and interior, becomes an essential thing. And as you pointed out, there's the one thing that we cannot live without, and that's air. You guys have taken a very beautiful and technological approach to purifying that air that we breathe, and making it so that we can all breathe a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm. It's important.
It's important. So again, thank you so very much for your time. We really appreciate the hour that you got to spend with us.
Thanks to both of you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Cool. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this has been another edition of the Complete Human Podcast with your hosts,
Jenna Breslin
and Evan DeMarco. We will see you next week.
Bye, everyone.